Is there really an autism epidemic? Let's talk about this. Hello everyone, it's Amanda with Eat, Pray, Crunch. Thank you so much for coming on over to my channel and checking out this video. My channel is all about moderately crunchy lifestyle and parenting. So if that is something that interests you, be sure to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell if you are interested in seeing more content like this in the future. So April is Autism Awareness Month. And if you guys didn't already see the video that I made several weeks ago about my son, I would encourage you to go check those out. I will link them here in the cards. I talk all about our path to diagnosis with him. In a nutshell, my son is 5 years old and he is twice exceptional, meaning that he is both gifted and high functioning autism. So this is a topic that is very near and dear to our hearts, and I have learned in the last couple of years so much about the autism spectrum. There are so many things that I used to think about it that I no longer think are true. And that is one of the things that I wanted to talk about today. I'm gonna put this out there up front. I know this is a controversial topic, but I feel like it is a very important one, and I am all about seeking truth whenever I can from relevant sources and scientific research-based sources. So that is how I have formed my viewpoints on this kind of thing. There are actually some really good videos on this topic that I will have linked below. So if you want to see more information about this kind of thing, be sure to check those out in the description down below. So the big question of the day, are autism rates actually on the rise? Because if you've been following the media for the last 10-15 years, that's what major headlines would lead you to believe, that there is this autism epidemic. But long story short, the answer is no, there is not an autism epidemic. The rates are not actually on the rise. And there are actually statistical reasons behind this. When you are looking at statistics, you have to be so careful in how those statistics are presented and how they are used. Just the way they are presented can be very misleading. So let's look at the big picture here. Really, what has been happening is that with all of the scientific research that is constantly broadening and the understanding of mental health, it's basically helping us to much better understand mental health than we ever have before. And that explains why it appears that autism rates are on the rise. So basically, even a generation ago, even like when I was a kid, like in the 80s and the 90s, the criteria for what was considered to be autism was much more narrow than it is now. The DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, I believe that's what it stands for, but that's basically the Bible of how psychological practitioners make a mental health diagnosis, is according to this. It has all of the criteria that they use to make a diagnosis. We are currently on the DSM-5, and that version came out in 2013. So even between the DSM-4 and the DSM-5, the definition of autism has changed since then. In the DSM-4, they had different categorizations for the autism spectrum. So they had the PDD-NOS, which is pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, which was basically the category that they threw all kids into that didn't quite fit the autism description. And then there was the full-blown autism diagnosis, which usually included verbal delay and intellectual disability, that kind of thing. And then they had the category of Asperger's, which a lot of people are much more familiar with that term, Asperger's, which is basically what is now considered high-functioning autism, people who have average or above average intelligence and verbal ability, but with a lot of these autistic tendencies. But when the DSM-5 came out, all of those little categorizations went out the window and they just included everything in the autism spectrum disorder. It is a very large umbrella now, much larger than it ever used to be. And there's some, debate about whether it is too broad or not, but that's a topic for another day. But part of that is a good thing because we much better understand what autism is now, whereas in previous generations we didn't know. That does not mean that it didn't exist in previous generations in the same rate that it exists now. In previous generations, what we now call autism was called something else. So, for example, a lot of people who were much more low-functioning autism were just considered to have a mental disability or mental retardation. Those are terms now that are considered to not be politically correct, but that's the terms they actually used in the DSM at that time. But a lot of those conditions are now folded into autism. Those people were autistic, but they didn't understand it that way then. And then on the other end of the spectrum, with the much more high-functioning autism, this is where I really think that they are including a lot more of the numbers of people who are on the spectrum than they used to. I really believe this to be a major part of it. Just looking at high-functioning autism rates. In previous generations, it just wasn't a thing. People didn't recognize that certain behaviors were autism spectrum a generation or two or more ago. What would have been considered to be an eccentric person a couple of generations ago was likely high-functioning autistic. There are a lot of famous people in history who've made great contributions to science and history and research and that kind of thing who were likely on the spectrum. For example, Albert Einstein, they think, was very likely on the autistic spectrum. But he wasn't included in the numbers of autism rates of his time. I can very much see this in a certain branch of the family, and I'm not going to say whose side of the family. I just want to keep it vague for people's privacy in our family. But there is a branch of the family, I'd say that a large percentage of that branch of the family shows autistic spectrum tendencies. Almost none of those people in that side of the family have a diagnosis. There are a couple who do, actually, so I do know that it is actually there and it actually has been diagnosed in some of those family members, but a lot of those people haven't. And from what I understand of it now, I think that there is a lot of undiagnosed autism spectrum going on there. All of those people in previous generations were not being included in the autism rates numbers. But now, had they been children in the current generation, they would have been diagnosed. You have to take that into consideration. With this better understanding of what autism is, and having a much broader definition of what autism spectrum means, it just includes a lot more people. And I, with all my heart, believe that there have always been the same number of autistic people in the world. We're just recognizing that now. Now, I'm going to address a very controversial topic here, and this is something that I have researched extensively. I have a very deep understanding of this. And most of the people that I know who also have kids on the spectrum have this viewpoint as well. Do vaccines cause autism? Nope. Nope, they don't. Because, like I said, the rates are not actually rising. It is just better recognized now. I'm not here to have a battle in the comments about that. In fact, if that's something you want to do, I suggest you go elsewhere to do that. Autism is not caused by vaccines. This is coming from someone who actually does a delayed vaccination schedule with my children. I had no vaccines when I was pregnant with my son. He has been on a very delayed vaccine schedule, and yet this is still a thing. I truly believe that even if we hadn't vaccinated him, he would still be on the spectrum because it is genetic. There is a very strong genetic component. Like I said, there is a branch of the family that I believe it is likely coming from. It's just a matter of genetically rolling the dice. He happened to get that gene. Now, if you guys aren't familiar with what epigenetics is what they have discovered in the last decade or so, that genes can actually be turned on and off according to environment. So I'm not going to go as far as to say that it is only nature and that there's no environmental impact whatsoever, but that is something they are still researching, and there are no definitive answers other than it is like 99% not vaccines causing those genes to switch on. I personally believe that there are so many other environmental factors going on. We live in very toxic environments, and there are so many things that we are exposed to living in modern society. It's just kind of what comes with the territory. My theory is that you have to have the gene to be on the autism spectrum, but whether or not that autistic gene turns on could potentially be based on environment. There could maybe be something that switches that gene on or off. And, you know, and this is something that is vastly being researched right now as we speak. What is it that causes those genes to turn on and off? So I'm not going to claim that I have all the answers about that because I don't, but I am going to claim that it is not vaccines because I am certain that it is just the way my son has been since conception. And let me talk about that a little bit now. There are some reasons that lead me to believe that even before he was born, that he was likely on the spectrum. Looking back in retrospect now, I can tell that my son had sensory issues even in the womb. I remember when I was pregnant with Alex, we went to see The Hobbit in the movie theater, and there's lots of blood and thunder and really loud noises. And I remember when we were in there, I mean, he was normally a pretty chill little kid in my womb, but when we were watching the movie, he was kicking the hardest I had ever felt him kick. It was clear that he was distressed in there. He was moving, doing somersaults like all over the place. It was clear that he was distressed in there. You know, as soon as we walked out of that movie theater, he was still. I could even tell that before he was born, he had auditory sensory issues, which he still has now. So I had no vaccines when I was pregnant. This was obviously before he had any vaccines because he was still a fetus. It was pretty clear to me that he definitely had issues even before he was born. And he was just born with a very large head, which I mentioned a little bit in my video of his diagnosis. And that actually can be, you know, developmentally a sign of being on the spectrum. Not always, but that same branch of the family that I think has a lot of autism spectrum going on, that branch of the family also has large heads. And so, you know, that's something that he was born with. Like in utero, his head was measuring large. I had a very long birth with him. I had a 35-hour birth for a couple of reasons, but one of them was that his head was giant, and getting his head through my pelvis was a real feat. When he came out, his head was more than cone-shaped. He actually had like a little ring around his skull where his head was stuck in my pelvis for a long period of time. You know, that's another thing that's very much like that is the way he was conceived, that was the way he was born. In his case, it's very much nature. Now, who knows if there was something, you know, that happened at the moment of conception, something in my womb, like, you know, there are factors in the womb that we don't fully understand yet. Maybe something switched on that gene in him. Who knows? There are some things we just don't know. All I know is that it is something that he was very much born with, and it has a very strong genetic component. With all of the genome research that they have done in the last couple of years, they are like understanding more and more at a crazy rate. It's really kind of awesome. In some cases of autism, they have pinpointed it to very specific genes, and sometimes a microdeletion of part of a gene is very strongly correlated with autism. So, you know, once again, a very genetic component, not vaccines. So anyway, just going back to recognizing that in previous generations, there likely were just as many autistic people, and those people probably had much more difficult lives because it just wasn't very understood. And, you know, people who were different in any way were just considered to be weird or eccentric or, you know, mentally disabled in some way, just depending on where on the spectrum they were. But I hear stories of people in this branch of the family who a couple of generations back, even in the 50s or in the early 1900s, that showed these tendencies where they had a lot of social difficulty for various reasons and various types of interpersonal strife, I guess you could say. Just hearing these stories, I'm like, Yep, that would explain it. Not that I can like officially diagnose people who are no longer here, who lived in the past, but you know, you can theorize about these things, and it seems pretty clear knowing what I know about autism now. I'm like, those sound like very much autistic tendencies. Along with that, just like Alex, in that branch of the family, there's a very strong lineage of giftedness as well. Very highly intellectual people who are mildly on the autism spectrum. So it just makes so much sense that that's the way our son is. So to answer the question, is autism an epidemic? Are the autism rates rising? The answer is no. No, they are not. And in the grand scheme of things, it's really good that we have such a better understanding of this now. This will be a topic for another day, but this applies to all types of mental health issues. We just so much better understand this kind of thing now. If you look at ADHD, if you look at bipolar, if you look at depression and anxiety, something that I have personally talked about on my channel. If you want to see my anxiety story, I will put that here. These things are just so much better understood, and we have better ways to cope with them now too. I think that that is a good thing. The fact that so many more people are getting a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder now is not a bad thing. It's actually a really good thing. And I think really what it does more than anything is it just makes us realize how many people on the autism spectrum are among us, and that it's a lot bigger number than we realized just because we better understand it now. And I think that that is also a good thing in just helping people who are on the spectrum interact with neurotypical people better, and you know, having these people understand each other better, because they've always been there and there's just been a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of problems because of that misunderstanding in the past. And I just think it's so great that it's so much better understood now, and that we have tools to deal with it so much better now. You know, I almost think that it's like a tragedy that it didn't happen sooner, because I think about all of the people who, you know, have struggled so much in their lives when it didn't necessarily have to be that way, where a diagnosis might have actually really helped them if they had gotten it in childhood and gotten the proper intervention and that kind of thing. It could have potentially made their lives a little bit easier and a little more fulfilling, you know? So if anything, I think it's actually a good thing that there are so many more diagnoses now. But that doesn't mean that the actual rate of people on the autism spectrum is greater now. It just means that the diagnosis rate is greater now. Anyway, I hope that that was informative to you guys. This is a topic that I'm really passionate about, and I really want to talk more about this in general too. We are understanding mental health better now than we ever have before. I am certain that we will continue better understanding mental health issues, and I just think it's so cool that as we better understand, it's becoming less of a taboo. And that is one of my main reasons for wanting to make videos about this kind of thing, is because I think that mental health issues are just so much more prevalent than people ever cared to realize before. And it's something that affects almost everyone in some way, shape, or form. If not yourself, then someone you love, somebody that you work with, you know, somebody in your life that you interact with will deal with a mental health issue in some way, and having a better understanding of that only makes for a better society. So mental health is a topic you can look forward to seeing more on my channel, and if that's something you're excited about, give me a thumbs up so I know that that is something that you are interested in, and let's definitely talk about it in the comments below. I know that I covered a number of controversial topics in this video, so I do ask that you please keep it respectful. I engage in dialogue and conversation with people when it's respectful, and when it's not, I delete comments, because I have that power, you know. I have the power to make my channel be a positive, affirming place for people. So if you are not helping that agenda, then your comment will be deleted. So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this video. If you found it informative, definitely give it a thumbs up, and leave a comment below telling me about your experience and your thoughts on this topic, because I think it's really interesting and really important. So thank you guys so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye.